This is for the ACOTAR girlies, and you are welcome. If you've read the A Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J Maas, and you are looking for your next romantasy series to obsess over, then I have got the books for you. I feel like there's quite a few of us who are searching for the next ACOTAR-like fantasy series, and I think it's sometimes more about the way the series made you feel than about the fantasy itself. Does that make sense? Here are my best and worst ACOTAR book recommendations, starting with my top 3. This might be an obvious one, but we're starting with Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. This book follows Violet Sorrengail as she enters the elite Dragon Riders military academy, where riders are trained in the hopes of bonding with a dragon, but fewer dragons are willing to bond with cadets, so there's a competitive and tough environment. She was meant to become a scribe, but her mother, the general, had other plans for her, and of course on her first day she meets Xaden Ryerson, and he's the most powerful and ruthless wing leader in the Riders Quadrant, and he doesn't like her, or rather he hates her mother because her mother sentenced his father to death for starting a rebellion. So to sum up, there's a lot going on in this book. Basically, it's enemies to lovers, there's dragons, there's dragon riders, there's a lot of fantasy politics and a lot of secrets. And this book is just a wild ride. Okay, so why is this book on the list, you might ask? On the surface, they might seem very different, but I often describe Fourth Wing as ACOTAR with dragons. If you like Reese, you'll like Xaden. If you like the Inner Circle, you'll like the friendships in this book. It's just got the same vibes. I love the dragons and like the dragon lore in this series. That is probably the best bit for me. I also love how we have a disabled main character in a fantasy novel as well. This is a top ACOTAR book rec. I bet a lot of you have already read it. And if you have read it, then you should check out my other video where I go into more detail about why I think this book is so similar to ACOTAR, but there are spoilers. Honestly, the reason why I started with Fourth Wing was so I could recommend the next book, and that is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. This book is like if ACOTAR and Fourth Wing had a book baby. It's got fae, it's got dragons, it's got a vengeful assassin and a warrior king. There's like this epic slow burn romance. There's a past and present timeline as well. There's secrets and mysteries to figure out, and some of the world building in this book is just so beautiful. This book might be a little bit slow to get going, but like once I got into it, I was obsessed. I've only recently read this book, but I think it is gonna be a favourite. It's definitely the favourite on this list. And in the next book, there are no fae and no dragons, but there are vampires. And it is The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent. Aurea is the adopted human daughter of the Nightborn vampire king, and he's been training her to enter a legendary but deadly tournament held by the goddess of death herself. The winner is rewarded with immortality and power, and the plan is for Aurea to become a vampire by winning and merging her powers with her father. But first she must win, and she's not the only one entering. Ends up forming an alliance with Rain, a ruthless vampire who also happens to threaten her father's crown. So it's another enemies to lovers setup. There's a deadly trial, there's mystery, and there's questions over who to trust. A lot of people describe this book as being like the Hunger Games but with vampires, but there's a lot more romance in this book than in the Hunger Games, and that's why it's on the list. With the enemies to lovers plotline, the romance, and the fantasy world, that's why I feel like ACOTAR fans will love this book. This is the first book in a duology. The second book is out, but I think there's going to be more books set in this world. So that's my top 3 ACOTAR book recs. My next book rec is one that I'm putting in the middle, and it is a super popular book, and it's probably really popular with ACOTAR fans as well, and for obvious reasons, but why it's not in my top 3 is that I personally didn't gel with this book, but I'm gonna include it anyway. And that's the Crescent City series by Sarah J Maas. This series starts off more urban fantasy than high fantasy, and it's a Sarah J Maas novel, so you know what you're gonna get. So it's obvious why this book is on the list. It's by the same author, and there is another reason that it's on the list, but that is a massive spoiler, so I'm not going to mention it. I really struggled with this series. I liked the first book, I was okay with the second book, and then I DNF'd the last book. I don't think I can explain why I DNF'd it without spoiling it, so not gonna say any more, but what I will say is that I think ACOTAR fans will enjoy this series, and it's by the same author, so you know what you're getting into. Okay, so now we're going on to the worst ACOTAR book recommendations. They're not necessarily bad book series, I just don't think people should recommend them as books to read after reading ACOTAR, if that makes sense. We're gonna start off with Zodiac Academy. How do I sum up this book? It's been a really long time since I attempted to read it. Okay, so 2 orphaned young women discover they're actually fae and are heirs to a throne they know nothing about. They're sent to this sort of magical school or college where they meet, and of course there are guys that they meet there. It's enemies to lovers or hate to love. There's mystery and magic. This is a very, very popular adult fantasy romance, or romantasy if you prefer. I think a lot of ACOTAR fans will enjoy this series, but it just simply wasn't for me. And I do think there's a big difference between the 2 series. Basically, I just can't do bully romance, and I didn't check that before I started this series, and that's on me. I started reading it because I was interested in the whole magic college situation. Then I found out it was a bully romance, and I stopped reading it and DNF'd it. But it is a super popular series. It's got lots of dedicated fans. I think you have to have a lot of commitment for this series because it's like 8 or 9 books. There's also, I think, like a spin-off connected series as well. If you don't mind bully romance and you're looking for a big, chunky fantasy romance series to get into, then this could be the one for you. This next book series gets recommended a lot, and I've seen it recommended a lot specifically as an ACOTAR book rec, and it is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, or the Folk of the Air series. I love this series. I love these books. I just adore them. I read them so quickly. I just inhale anything from this series. But it's not an ACOTAR book rec. I feel like whenever it's recommended, it's often the enemies to lovers plotline that really gets like hyped or pushed. But the romance storyline is like a subplot. It's like a side plot. This is a young adult political fantasy with romance. And the fairies in this series are really different from the ACOTAR fae. These fairies feel more inspired by traditional fairy folk tales. I always recommend this series, but I would never recommend it as read this book after ACOTAR. No. The last book on this list, and one that I'm sort of 50-50 on this one, and that book is From Blood and Ash. This series follows the main character Poppy, who is chosen as the maiden for her kingdom, and she lives a very isolated but privileged life waiting for the day of her ascension. One of her guards gets killed and is replaced by Hawk, and Poppy finds herself drawn to him. He's keeping secrets from her, but she's also keeping secrets of her own, and the rulers are also keeping secrets from everyone. I would say this book is popular with a lot of ACOTAR fans, and there are similar themes and similar vibes, but I think as the series continues, it kind of lost its way a little bit. The first 2 books are probably the best. I loved this big reveal moment in book 1, and I kind of found things went downhill from there. I found there was too much repetition, and I actually DNF'd the 3rd book, and then I gave my copies away to a friend. That's why I don't recommend it as an ACOTAR book rec, sadly. So that is my top ACOTAR book recs and my not so top ACOTAR book recs. Do you have any favourite fantasy romance series that you recommend to ACOTAR fans? If so, let me know in the comments. If you watch the next video, you will find out why I think Fourth Wing is just ACOTAR with dragons. But remember, there are spoilers. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to hit the like button, follow for more, and hit that notification bell to keep up to date with any new content.